Hello, this is Al Black with Chewing the Gristle and my co-host, Tim Conroy. We are a poetry chat. And our poet today is the poet laureate of Indiana and retired emeritus professor Matthew Graham. Matthew Graham is the author of four previous books of poetry: New World Architecture, 1946, A World Without End, and his most recent book, The Geography of Home, on Galileo Press. He is the recipient of awards and fellowships from the Academy of American Poets, Pushcart, the Indiana Arts Commission, and the Vermont Studio Center. Graham is emeritus professor of English at the University of Southern Indiana in Evansville, Indiana, and is married to the painter Kathryn Waters. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, Matthew, could you tell us about your poetry journey and education? Did you write poetry in high school and college? And in that journey, who were your early poetry influences?
Well, sure. Yeah, in high school, I was writing what I thought was poetry, but it wasn't really. I think I was writing song lyrics and trying to pretend they were poems. I mean, it was a time when there were so many great lyricists like Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell, and I was just fascinated by the language they used, and so I think song lyrics really got me interested in poetry initially. And when I got to college, I discovered real poetry. Not that those lyricists are not poets, but something a little higher level, I suppose. And a great revelation happened to me. I realized they were living poets. I thought all poets were dead. I mean, really, when I got to college, I thought maybe Robert Frost was the end of it. And I suddenly discovered living poets that were actually out there writing. And I discovered quite soon James Wright and Phil Levine. And they knocked me out because they were working class guys writing about working class people and situations and giving their lives some dignity. And these were lives I knew and understood. And they used a language that was, to me, very American, and it was my language. And so I suddenly realized that poetry was a contemporary living thing, and I think they were a great influence on me. I know they were. Um, Levine was this hard-scrabbled Jewish character out of Detroit who worked in the factories, and James Wright wrote about the Ohio Valley and the factory workers and the farmers in that area, and some tough lives. I didn't realize, of course, that Levine had spent a lot of time in Spain and was very influenced by Lorca, which I didn't know at the time, of course, and that James Wright had been very influenced by Neruda and the new translations that were coming out of South America. Later on in life, I also discovered those poets, and I could see the connections. As far as my education, I was a terrible high school student. The Vietnam War was going on, and I was certain I was going to be drafted, and yet I had to have a hall pass to go to the bathroom. It just seemed crazy to me at the time, and I couldn't wait to get out, but my grades were hideous, and so I was rescued by a community college for a year, and I got into that experience, and I loved it, and was able to get my grades up and transfer to it was the State University of Binghamton in New York, where I did my undergraduate work. And then I went on and got a master's from the writers' seminars at Johns Hopkins University. And then years later, I went on and got the MFA from the Iowa Writers' Workshop in Iowa. And so that was my education. And then I've been teaching here in Indiana for 35 years. I just retired in January. And so that's pretty much my brilliant career.
Congratulations on retirement.
Thank you. And it's a great time to retire, too. When I hear what my colleagues are going through with not knowing what's going to happen in the classroom or out of the classroom, and it's a mess, and it's scary, and they don't even know if departments are going to shut down. They have no idea what's going to happen. And so I was very lucky to get out when I did.
Yeah, it brings me, I was going to ask this question later, but I think I'll ask it now is,
Sure.
what's the poet's role right now in the moment of this, of the protest and the pandemic? What's
Yeah.
our role, Matthew?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because I've been, again, as poet laureate, I've been very stymied about things I can do around the state. And so I've been doing kind of a blog on the Indiana Humanities website. In April, I did one for Poetry Month. I'm calling it Poetry in Our Times. And I asked a number of important Hoosier writers why poetry was important to them and why it's important now. And I got some incredible interviews. It's a great site to go to. But most recently, I just finished up one called Protest and Pandemic, where again, I asked Indiana writers to respond to what's been going on, that we can't be silent. Writers especially cannot be silent in these times. And I got a lot of, I think, really, really interesting, good responses, which started and continued, I think, some very important conversations that we're all having, and if we're not, we should be having. So I think the poet's role is to keep that conversation going as much as anybody's role is, I think. But those are two sites I'm kind of proud of having put together. I just thought writers can't be silent, poets can't be silent. We've got to talk about these things. And so I don't know if that really answers your question, but I've been thinking about it a lot.
The other question I wanted to ask you, what is your process? And I know this is sort of a question that's often asked.
Sure.
So, take it a little bit deeper than the question, I guess, is what is your process for writing a poem?
Well, it's changed considerably since the times have changed. I don't know how you guys feel, but I just have felt so distracted and just, I don't know how to explain it. I thought with more time on my hands, especially now that I'm retired, I'd have more time to work, but I just can't seem to buckle down. And my wife's, as you said, a painter, and she feels the same way. And then we feel really guilty. We should be, should be doing more. So my process normally is I do everything I tell my students not to do, really. I tell them to keep a journal, to put aside a couple hours a day if possible. Think of like going to the gym. I don't do any of that stuff. I normally just have some ideas floating around in my head for a while, and it takes me a long time to commit them to paper, and I do write longhand. And then once I get started and I think it's going somewhere, I'll then type it up and see what I think about it. But I don't write daily. I read a lot. And when I'm stuck, I think I read even more because I think all artists are, thieves. And that's where I get my inspiration. But lots of times I just have a line floating around in my head for a while, but it'll take me a long time to commit to sitting down and working on it.
Do you sit down on your porch where you are now?
No, usually I'm lucky enough to have a little room in the house that's my kind of office, and my library's in there, and I usually write in there. I'm lucky that my wife's incredibly intelligent and literate, and she's my first reader always. So if I get something to the point I want to show it to somebody, I show it to her first. And she's very honest, and she'll either tell me this is stupid and wrong-headed, throw it away, or you might want to work on it. And so I take it from there usually. But I haven't really, my book came out, about almost 2 years, I guess now. And I haven't really done a lot since then. I've been working on some new poems. I don't know if you want me to go into this or not, but we went to see a show in St. Louis on Dutch artists of the Rembrandt period, and it was called The Line. And I started thinking about how important the line is, obviously in art, but also in poetry. I think that's the key unit in a poem is the line. And so I started writing down lines of when I read something someone wrote that I like a lot. And I'm doing a series of poems called beginning with a line from, and then the poem starts with that line, and then I build the poem off of that. And that's been kind of fun to do, especially since I don't have any really fresh new ideas at the moment, and I'm kind of spinning off other people's ideas.
I love your imagery in your poetry.
Well,
I mean,
thanks.
it seems to have so many cinematic elements.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and so, how about if we hear a few poems right now from you?
Well, sure. Okay, yeah. I'll read a couple of things from the new book. I think I'll read the first poem first because it's kind of funny, and I think that's important in poetry sometimes. You guys are old enough to remember Dick and Jane, I'm sure. Our audience might not be aware of them, but I don't know. How would you describe who Dick and Jane were? It was grammar school readers, and they were characters. We read about their lives in these readers, and they were teaching us how to read at the same time. But I think they're also teaching us an American lifestyle, or I don't know.
Sort of a cardboard cutout of an American lifestyle.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they were not like any kids I knew, you know. I mean, their dad seemed to go off to an office somewhere, and mom stayed home, and they lived in the suburbs, and everybody was white, and everybody was middle class, at least, I would assume. And if they got in trouble, it was pretty minor, but there was always a moral to be learned from the trouble they got in. I mean, they never, robbed liquor stores or anything like my friends are doing. So anyway, I wrote this poem about Dick and Jane, and it's called Dick and Jane. Oh, how I hated their precious pets and perfect parents, their goody two-shoed lives balanced on the footbridge of white bread and moral smugness. But they taught me to read, taught me to live. And then they vanished from the public eye in 1965, aged 10 and 8. They'd be in their late 50s, early 60s by now. And I hope it was a rocky ride of rehab and therapy, but it wasn't really. Jane's first marriage was short and terrible, but her second was happy. She's a retired nurse practitioner with 3 loving grandchildren. Dick still works as an insurance adjuster and is a closeted member of the school board. Isn't it funny how in some ways we were never children and in other ways we always are? But they taught me to read, taught me to see. See the weary light on the lawn of late summer. See the years rise like ash into a starless sky. See Spot run. And of course, Spot was their dog. And I think one of the first sentences you learned to read was very simple ones like see Spot run.
And that's the opening poem of the Geography of Home, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And tell us a little bit about that collection and how you put those poems together.
Well, I worked on it for a long time. I'm a very slow writer and kind of a lazy writer, as I kind of suggested. But I've been thinking a long time about what home is and all its repercussions and ramifications in terms of the physical places that we grew up in and the places we moved to, but also kind of the metaphoric homes we've had over the years and ancestral homes as well. In my case, that would be Ireland and Scotland. And so I just started, as I was writing these poems, I could see a theme developing, that they were connected in that sense. The fact that our pasts are a home, your memories are a home that you go back to. And I guess those were the kind of themes I was trying to weave together in the book.
And can we hear another poem from that first section of that book?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Because maybe we can go through the sections a little bit. Because that's
okay.
Awesome.
Well, I could read the title poem, The Geography of Home, which again is about childhood. And the first section of the book is a lot more about childhood, I think. So it's called The Geography of Home. There's no GPS for the past, no way to get back to those nights spent ceaselessly watching for Sputnik to wander across the eastern sky, or to those days that seem now as delicate as the cellophane wings of dragonflies, helicoptering over the rotting rowboat sinking in the green shade of a lost lake, or as sudden as the curtain of rain that sometimes swept that lake in late summer, like a boundary between then and the possibility of now. So much lonely time measured in a place of fading light by the arc of barn swallows, and the dying blue-black panic of bottle flies stuck to the yellow fly paper hung over the wringer washer on grandmother's back porch. Again, some references to the past that younger readers may not know. Flypaper, remember that horrible stuff?
Yes.
remember walking into it like, ah!
Well, I know, from your first couple comments that you're a very reflective thinker. And I'm a slow writer. I mean, I don't, it takes me a while to get things down on the page. And I read collections for fuel.
Yeah. That's what I was trying to say earlier. Yeah. Absolute fuel. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And so what makes a good poem for you? What, to you, to Matthew Graham, what makes it a good poem?
Well, I love fresh and interesting imagery, number one. I like a sense of a narrative too, to a certain extent. Doesn't mean I don't like lyrical poems. That one was kind of lyrical, but I do like a little bit of a story. Sometimes I like a little bit of mystery I don't quite understand. But mainly it's the imagery, and I think I want a poem to show me something I know but haven't really thought of in that way before. You know what I mean? It's like, oh yeah, makes me want to do that somehow. I don't know, like Rilke said in Ode to an Archaic Apollo, the last line is, "You must change your life." And he's talking about what great art should do to us. And, I don't know if I put that kind of weight on a poem or not, that it must change your life. But I think that it makes you think about life and your own life a little bit, and realize that we have so much in common, all of us, and a poem can connect us sometimes. And even if it's not our experience, you go, oh yeah, I feel that, I never thought of it that way before, but I know what you're talking about. I think that's what I like in a poem. Too much obscurity bothers me in a poem after a while. I mean, come on, I want to know what you're talking about. I want to feel something too, I want to feel something. So I guess I want an emotional response and an intellectual response from it.
Man, I think your poetry, Matthew, it has these wonderful, these first lines are just unbelievable in your poems. And they often start with imagery.
Yeah.
So Brother Al, before I run off on my mouth too long, I'll let you ask a question.
Well, you were asking great questions. And I was actually thinking of that longer poem that I read out loud today when we were prepping for Matthew before he came on. His one about Walt Whitman is just a fabulous, fabulous poem.
Oh, thanks. That's one of my favorites. I was just channeling Whitman, that thing, he just kind of came through to me. And 19th century New York as well. It was fun to do some research, and then I fell into his rhythms, which were biblical and then Whitmanesque, and it was that just fell into place, And it's not about me, which is so great. I also get tired of poems that are all about me,
Well, it's a marvelous poem, and I encourage folks to look it up. What book is that in?
Oh, that's in this one.
That's okay.
The new one.
Really?
Yeah.
But then I found it up on Galileo Press, has it on their website.
Oh, do they? I didn't even realize that. Well, That's nice of them.
Yes. So in talking about your poems, how much time do you spend in revision, and when do you, the poet, know it's finished?
That's a great question. I spent a lot of time revision. I mean, I want it to be as good as it can possibly be, and I don't believe in Allen Ginsberg's theory of first word, best word, that whole beat theory. Sometimes maybe, but most of the time it's just, you're there with a chisel, or I also think of it as like whiskey, it needs to be distilled, the language to distill it, you distill it until you finally get down to what's the best stuff. So I spent a lot of time revising, which my students always hated that. Their first word, best word, of course, because they're brilliant and they're geniuses. But the revision's kind of the fun part too, So yeah, I revise a lot. How do you know when it's done? There's a great quote by Laureate who says, again, very pretentiously, "A poem is never finished, it's only abandoned." Yeah, I guess he's right, I remember asking my wife, who, as a painter, she's, you can see her artwork on the book. She's a realist. And I would say to her, how do you know when a painting's done? I mean, you could just keep picking at that thing forever. And she threw it back at me and said, how do you know when a poem is done? And I don't know, I guess in some ways you just figure this is as good as I can get it, because you could pick at stuff. As writers, you guys know that you could, even when you get something published, you might look at it and go, I want to change that line. It's kind of stupid. And you just got to say, no, it's done.
I do readings and change the poem
When
that's
you
in
read
the
it?
book as
Yeah.
I'm reading it.
I've read poems by famous poets. I change their lines when I read them. I didn't like that line.
So within this revision process and everything, are there resources or practices or books you'd recommend to an emerging poet?
I mean, there's really no how-to book with poetry, but I guess I'd say the same thing any writer would say, you just got to read a lot, and read everything, I probably read a lot more fiction and nonfiction than I do poetry. I mean, you don't curl up with a book of poetry, for the afternoon usually. I mean, I like to pick through poetry, I like to spend some time on it, but I want a deep, serious read. I get into a big, heavy novel. But I also learn an awful lot about language that way too. I mean, I just think reading is the most important thing you can possibly do. And for younger writers, read contemporary poets. Find out who's publishing right now. And read everybody. I mean, read the classics and read some of the old boys and girls, but then also find out who's writing around your age or a little older. What are they up to? What's going on right now? Which is not hard with the internet to find out at all. It's much easier than when we were kids. You're like, where do I start? Where do I begin? Of course, it helps to take classes, I think, too, if that's feasible. Or even communities have community workshops, and they can set you on the right path. I think a creative writing class if you can do anything, it can save you time. People can say, you can be working by yourself in the dark forever. And I think it helps to have someone give you some direction, or maybe say what you're doing is really kind of dumb and maybe you should rethink that. Saves you time. So I guess that's my advice.
That's very good advice. Thank you.
Sure.
Tim.
Yeah, sometimes what happens, I think, with the emerging poet when they start a process of really engaging and reading, they imitate. The natural thing is to imitate who you love.
Right.
And it takes, what advice can you give them about the process of imitation leading to discovery? A voice.
Yeah, no, that's the whole thing, isn't it? And yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because that was always the fight I'd have with students is, I'd have occasionally students say, well, I don't like to read, but I want to write, and I said, well, go away, go somewhere else. Because their excuse would be, I don't want to be I don't want to be influenced by somebody else. I'm like, well, if you start writing like Faulkner, that'd be a real problem. It's like, how do you learn to play soccer? You imitate the pros. All kids know that. Everybody does the moves of athletes to try to learn how to get better. So imitation's fine. I would never worry about that at all. But then slowly, I think you start to develop your own voice. I mean, we're all apprentices, and you learn from the masters, and you take from the masters, and then you add to them. We're all standing on the shoulders of shoulders of shoulders of shoulders. And you finally, I think, through time, practice, patience, and luck, start to develop your own voice. That's yours, and specifically yours. But it takes a long time, and there's nothing wrong about imitating people.
Hey, Matthew, let's hear some more of your voice and maybe read a couple more poems for us.
Well, I mean, in the first part of the book, again, it goes from childhood to a number of actual homes I had. I have one about New Orleans that I kind of like. Would you want to hear that one? How stable the city of God, how disordered the city of man. And it begins with a quote from Little Queenie and the Percolators. And the quote is, "My darlin' Nolans. The year of my first city, when the Neville brothers were the bar band at Tipitina's, when the wild Tapatolas tribe descended on St. Joseph's Day, a firebomb of feathers and blue sequins. The year spent 2 weeks at a time on a towboat and 1 week of mischief at a time in the quarter. Is the Altan Solan still there, or has it vanished like a memory of a bad memory? The year the river ran like dengue fever through the blood of Magazine Street. The year of dancing madly to the ancient drums in the turmoil of Congo Square. The year of the girls from the Desire Street Project with their golden wisdom teeth. The year of voodoo and zydeco and heat lightning lasered against the trembling night. The year the night tripper played his broken squeeze box for all those troubled ghosts outside the Napoleon House. The year they dusted off Professor Longhair from his janitor job in a warehouse in the Irish Channel and propped him back up at his piano. And the year they released his Lost Sessions, not lost, not even misplaced, merely an answer to how love is revealed. So,
Wonderful.
I'm sorry?
That was wonderful.
Oh, thanks. It was kind of fun just to take all these memories, of a time when you were young and spent someplace kind of interesting and throw them all together in the poem. And it was fun to go back over those memories and create a time and a place. So that was neat to do.
How much research do you do?
It depends on the poem, of course. That one was just memory, I just never forget Little Queenie and the Percolators, who was a band in New Orleans at the time, and she rhymed darling with New Orleans, darling Nolans. I thought, oh my God. And you remember the Neville brothers, of course, and they were the bar band down the street from where I lived. And so it was kind of a neat time, it was late 70s. Got a dog poem, is that okay? It's called The Sadness of Dogs, and again it begins with a quote from a Bedouin proverb, and the quote is, although the dogs bark, the caravan moves on. They slunk out of the shadows to sit with us by the fire 15,000 years ago. They only envied us speech, and they came to hear our stories. Stories of bravado and honor, stories that always seem to end in sadness. And the sadness you see in their amber eyes is the unconditional sadness they have for us, for our limited and listless lives. They have their days, their star, their years. And although dogs live forever, I've seen them, they've seen our tents struck, our caravans move on. They regard our pointless departures from a distance and either follow the fire or stay and try to tell their troubles to the moon. The moon, their only real friend, and whose only response is the reflected, ordinary light of sadness.
Delightful.
I love dogs.
So you have one?
I do. Yeah, she's an old mutt rescue dog. She's 14 and she's getting pretty old, and her back legs are starting to go on her, and it's very sad. And but we're keeping her going, keeping her alive. So she's happy. So that's all right.
So do you have any advice for the emerging writer as to how to bring their emotional life into being within their poems?
Oh, you guys ask good and hard questions. I think poetry is interesting because I think that we always assume that what we're reading is autobiographical, don't we? I mean, I usually do. I mean, I think this really did happen. This is how this person really feels. When you're reading a novel or a short story, you realize you're reading about characters, and you don't think of the author so much. But I think in poetry, the author's right out there. So, you know, it's hard. I mean, you put your emotion out there, but what if you do a bad job at it, you know? You get slammed, which may be another reason why creative writing classes are good for you. You know, you throw it out there and say, okay, yeah, but it's not written very well. You need to do a better job. You need to do justice to the subject, to the feelings of the person. You know, I used to have that problem in classes. Somebody write a poem about their dead grandmother, very heartfelt, you know, etc., but cliched as hell and just terrible. And I would just have to say, you're not doing justice to your grandmother by using language that isn't doing the job it should be doing. But it's very hard and very risky, I think. You know, I think of the confessional poets, you know, Plath and Sexton and Berriman and Lowell, and how they're the first ones to really write about their very, very personal lives. And it was effective because, number one, they were geniuses, and number two, though, because they made their personal lives universal, I think. And I think that's the key to it. You know, you can write about something that's so personal to you, but somehow it's got to transcend yourself and become something larger than just you. I mean, I have nothing in common with Sylvia Plath as a human being. And yet I read her poems, and although I think she's overindulgent at times, I still get it lots of times, you know. I get what she's going through because I've felt it too in some aspect of that. So I think that's the key, you know, to that it's personal and heartfelt, but it rises above just you and becomes something bigger. Which, how do you do that? I don't know. I don't know.
You know, that's the hard thing, right? That's the thing we all work at and fail. And so when you first start out, even throughout your writing career, you know, what advice do you have for poets writing through the stage of mediocrity that we all have to go through?
Gosh, well, you know, teaching this stuff for 35 years, I should have some really good response to that question. But I can only, you know, I think, again, having the luxury of being connected with the university, students not only should have good mentors, but they have each other, you know. And also, we bring in professional writers all the time to give readings and talks and lectures, and here you're hearing people you probably will never ever hear again once you're outside of a university environment. For me personally, it was my colleagues more than my teachers. I had some very famous teachers. I was very, very lucky, fortunate, especially at Iowa. But truthfully, it was my peers. Some of them were so good, and they were pushing things and doing interesting, fresh stuff, and they were on fire, some of them, you know, and I could see them, you know, breaking through, and I said, either I'm going to get better, or I have to quit. You know, it's really how I felt. And I think they inspired me to read more, to think better, smarter, to use what limited resources I personally had and do something with them. I don't think you don't have to have a great education. You don't have to have lived in a Hemingway kind of life, though. I mean, that's not a bad thing to do, but I think it's good for writers to have as many experiences as possible to really live life. But if you can't write about it, what good is it, you know?
How can people get a hold of your books?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think you put up that website for Galileo Press, and that might be the best way. And I think Small Press Distributors, I believe, is the name that I think they also handle them. And as we mentioned, I'm sure Amazon.
Read a couple more poems, and I really love the poem that you end the book with. So as a special request,
Sure, yeah.
if I could hear that.
I mean, this might be one of the most honest poems. I mean, it's the last poem in the book because it's the last poem I wrote for this book, and you know, yeah, okay. It's called After a Certain Age. After a certain age, you only look in a mirror to see a mirror. The world begins to fray along the edges, and you become invisible. You know many dead people, and there's no one left to blame for your long lane of troubles but yourself. You can finally afford to be kind, yet you sometimes prefer the bankruptcy of quiet meanness. You forget the definition of righteous fury. The big ship sinks and dies. The mission to Mars will not return. become a scrivener of traffic and time. Tears are replaced with the boardroom of boredom and impatience. You can be assured a room without a view, a shore without a sea, a world without a home.
And it really kind of reminds you of the Philip Larkin poem.
Yes, yes. I know what you mean, exactly. Audubon, I believe it is. Is that the one you're thinking of?
I was thinking of, is it Old Fools?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, but he hasn't really admitted to become one yet.
Do we ever totally give it up?
Well, I don't know. That poem is pretty, it's like, okay, this is what this is the guy on the porch with the stick yelling at the kids, get off my yard.
Well, you capture, you capture such a great tone for that poem. I mean, the tone is perfect for that poem, for the words in that poem.
Well, I guess it's just kind of resigning oneself to old age and being very honest about it, in some ways it's a relief, so many things that made you crazy, you don't really care that much about anymore. I mean, I'm still crazy about a lot of things, especially our certain, political situation we're in right now, but it's not quite like I want to throw myself in front of a train or something, it's quieter.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, you have that great romantic poem. I don't think it's in this collection, but I think you wrote it while you were in Paris.
In a time of trains.
Yes.
About waiting for my wife. Yeah.
Yes. That's a wonderful cinematic piece.
Well, thank you, and I don't have it with me, unfortunately. I mean, I didn't bring it out here with me. But.
Well, you choose one last one.
One last one. Oh, okay. Let me think. Well, I want to read one called Milltown, and it's for Liam Rector, who's an old friend of mine, an incredible poet, incredible human being, who unfortunately killed himself. It's been probably 10 years by now. So I'm kind of writing in his voice a little bit. It's my voice, it's his voice. It's both of our backgrounds is what I'm writing about, and it's called Milltown. I grew up in Milltown and lived on Ash Street with its dirty snow and the strolling hard boys of no compromise and little conscience. But after being cuffed about the chops long enough, I got out of Milltown and somehow found myself at a good school reading fancy books, and then at a good job living good in the renovated meatpacking district of Culture Town. And Milltown became the mute dream, the dumb joke of the crippled children singing carols at the school for the blind. But sometimes at a poetry reading or a gallery opening or a charity ball, I'll flash on Milltown and have to go out into the street and have a smoke, to stop my hands from shaking, to shake off the shadows of smokestacks in that grinning, useless union hall. Occasionally at these venues I meet a certain kind of sophisticated woman, and when, after drinks and small talk, I see a flinch in her eye, a twitch a kicked dog makes when you move too soon, I know she knows Milltown. And if by chance we leave together, something that happens more frequently as I sink through middle age, and yet how long can this last? Not long. And climb into a cab and then into each other, we vow in our solitude together to never, ever, ever speak of nor remember. That's a nice happy poem.
Yeah, well, that's life, isn't it? In many ways.
Yeah, I think so.
This has been a wonderful session. And for me, a native Hoosier, to be able to be part of an interview with the poet laureate of Indiana is a special treat.
Well, I'm honored to have it, and I thank you guys so much for thinking of me. It's been really fun, and good questions, guys. Tough questions.